That day, Amy was certain she was about to live the happiest moment of her entire life. She woke up even before her alarm went off, lying still for a few seconds with her eyes fixed on the ceiling, savoring that rare blend of anxiety and joy that only a wedding day can bring. The house was already buzzing with movement. Relatives and friends moved between the kitchen and living room, checking every last detail as if orchestrating a scene from a movie. Penelope, her best friend since they were 8 years old, was already managing breakfast preparations, while Great Aunt Rose, with her slow, deliberate walk and serene voice, reminded everyone that marriage is the first chapter of the rest of your life. Amy and Maverick had been together for 4 years, and every aspect of this day had been planned to be flawless, perfect down to the last ribbon and flower petal. Until that moment, nothing hinted that everything was about to change in a way that would etch itself into her memory forever. As she dressed, Amy caught her reflection in the mirror and thought that everything truly fit together. The white gown was impeccable, its delicate lace catching the light. Her hair was styled exactly as she had always envisioned, and the light touch of makeup allowed the natural sparkle in her eyes to shine through. Penelope burst into the room laughing, teasing her that she was one step away from gracing the cover of a bridal magazine. To Amy, Penelope wasn't just her maid-of-honor. She was like a sister, someone who knew every corner of her life, every joy and every heartbreak. Maverick, for his part, had always been her refuge, the man who made her believe in stability, in the promise of a shared future. What Amy didn't know was that she was less than an hour away from watching that castle of trust collapse without warning, the kind of collapse that leaves a silence so deep it swallows every sound. Minutes before the ceremony was set to begin, Amy sensed something wasn't right. Maverick was nowhere to be found in the room assigned for him to get ready, and Penelope had also vanished. At first, she brushed it off as the normal chaos of any wedding day. Vendors calling with last-minute questions, a floral arrangement needing adjustment, a groomsman running late. But when she reached for her phone and dialed Maverick, the call connected and then abruptly ended without an answer. She tried Penelope next, and the exact same thing happened. Her fingers moved. Faster, trying both numbers again. Once, twice, 3 times. With the kind of growing insistence that comes when the mind begins scrambling for rational explanations. While a few guests casually asked where the groom was, Amy forced a polite smile and replied that he'd be along shortly, though a tight, unnamed weight was already pressing in on her chest. The event coordinator reminded her they were 10 minutes from starting, and that ticking countdown only amplified the hollowness of their absence. As the minutes bled away, worry stopped being a fleeting thought and became an urgent impulse. Amy searched the hallways, peeked into the garden, scanned the parking lot. She asked a couple of close friends if they'd spotted Maverick, but no one had any useful answer. Great Aunt Rose, watching quietly from a distance, noticed the faint tremor in Amy's hands when she returned to the hall and gently handed her a glass of water. Amy took it, sipping only enough to wet her lips. The soft background music still played, photographers lingered in position, yet the most essential element was missing. She opened her chat with Penelope, looking for any clue. The last message was from the night before. "Tomorrow I'll hug you so tight." A line that, in the light of this moment, felt suddenly hollow. The knot in Amy's stomach tightened. The suspicion that had been an unwelcome thought was now transforming into a chilling, tangible possibility. Something so wrong it would drive her to leave that place immediately in search of the truth. Amy knew she couldn't just stand there waiting for the pieces to fall into place on their own. Grabbing her car keys from her bag, she slipped out without alerting anyone, moving quickly so no well-meaning relative could intercept her with questions or reassurances she didn't want to hear. The warm afternoon air brushed against her skin, but she barely registered it. Her focus was locked on a single destination, the hotel where Maverick and Nyai, several out-of-town guests, were staying. Those 10 minutes behind the wheel felt like a slow, torturous crawl. The ticking of the dashboard clock became a metronome of dread, each second adding weight to the growing stone in her chest. She told herself perhaps he'd felt unwell, maybe needed to lie down for a while. Yet somewhere deep inside, she knew these were just flimsy lifelines her mind was throwing out to avoid the truth. The silence in his unanswered calls and texts felt too deliberate, too controlled. When she reached the hotel, Amy didn't hesitate. She crossed the lobby with measured steps, her resolve holding her upright even as her pulse thundered in her ears. The receptionist, recognizing her from previous planning visits, handed her a key card without a single question. Just a sympathetic nod that Amy barely noticed. The elevator ride was only seconds, yet the reflection in the mirrored wall unsettled her. Tense brows drawn together, jaw locked, breathing shallow. She walked down the hall until she reached Maverick's door. The card clicked, the handle turned, and the moment she stepped inside, reality seemed to split open. Maverick and Penelope were there, tangled in the crumpled bedsheets, their discarded clothes scattered across the floor. No raised voices, no frantic scrambling to hide, just a thick, suffocating silence that drained the oxygen from the room. Amy stood frozen, as if her body couldn't quite process that the two people she trusted most existed together in this raw, undeniable frame of betrayal. Amy took a slow step backward, the hallway's warm lighting suddenly feeling colder than any winter night she'd known. She shut the door with deliberate care, her fingers trembling as she reached into her bag for her phone. Without pausing to think, she called her brother, then two of her cousins, and finally Great Aunt Rose. She didn't want this to turn into a her word against theirs situation. She needed witnesses, people who could see exactly what she had just seen, so the truth could never be twisted or diminished. Within minutes, the sound of familiar footsteps echoed down the carpeted hallway. One by one, her relatives stepped into the room, and the stunned expressions that crossed their faces were all the confirmation Amy required. There was no misinterpretation possible, no context that could soften the image before them. The truth was naked, unfiltered, and devastating. Maverick and Penelope scrambled to pull the sheets around themselves, tripping over half-formed excuses that dissolved in the air before they could finish them. Amy's voice, when it came, was steady, almost chillingly so. She told them to get dressed. No yelling, no sobbing, no collapsing into grief. There was a controlled steel in her demeanor, the kind that signals a decision has been made in the marrow of the bones. As they made their way toward the elevator, the air between the group felt heavy, charged with unspoken judgments. Some family members averted their eyes, unwilling to meet the shame head-on, while others stared openly at the guilty pair, their disappointment radiating like heat. Amy walked in front, her pace unyielding, her mind fixed on what she knew had to come next, laying bare the truth in front of everyone, still waiting for a wedding that would never happen. When they arrived back at the ceremony venue, a low murmur was already rippling through the crowd. The bride's prolonged absence had stirred whispers. But no one could have anticipated the storm about to break. Amy stepped forward, her gown catching the light as she walked with measured resolve toward the center of the room. She reached for the microphone that had been prepared for her vows, and, with a quiet authority that cut through the chatter, asked for silence. Her voice, though steady, carried an undercurrent of tension that made every head turn. She announced that the wedding would not take place, that the man she was supposed to marry, and her maid of honor had betrayed her in the most intimate and deliberate way. And she wanted everyone to hear it directly from her, not through rumors or distorted retellings. Then, with a small but unmistakable gesture, she pointed toward Maverick and Penelope, who stood stiff and pale at the edge of the room. The room froze, as if time itself had been stunned into stillness. Only a few gasps and the shifting of feet broke the silence. Some guests stared wide-eyed at the accused, while others dropped their gaze to the floor, unwilling to meet the raw humiliation hanging in the air. Amy wasn't seeking pity. This was not a plea for comfort. It was a deliberate act of truth-telling, a severing of the last thread between herself and the lies she'd been living under. Without releasing the microphone, she turned and walked out into the garden, where the lake mirrored the late afternoon sky. She slipped the engagement ring from her finger, held it for a moment in her palm, and then, with a decisive flick of her wrist, sent it into the water. The tiny splash was barely audible, yet to Amy it was a sound that sealed an ending, Without glancing back, she re-entered the hall, fully aware that in those few steps, she had closed one story for good and stepped into the unknown chapter that began with her standing on her own 2 feet. From that moment on, Amy never again set foot in the house she had shared with Maverick. That same night, she gathered a few essentials, clothes, documents, a box of keepsakes that still mattered to her, and drove to her cousin Clara's small apartment. There, surrounded by the quiet hum of a neighborhood far removed from the chaos of the day, she allowed herself to sit in stillness. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of that hotel room snapped back into focus like an unwanted photograph burned into her mind. But she knew staying frozen in that pain wasn't an option. A few days later, she began searching for her own place, somewhere entirely hers, free of shared memories or the shadow of betrayal. Within a week, she signed the lease on a modest apartment with wide windows that flooded the space with light and a small balcony overlooking a calm, tree-lined street. The first time she turned the key and stepped inside, she felt the faint but undeniable rush of a new beginning. She decided to redecorate gradually, choosing colors and furniture that reflected the person she was becoming, not the version of herself who had molded her life around someone else's needs. Around that same time, she accepted an offer to take on additional responsibilities at the school where she taught, a position she had declined before out of fear it would leave too little time for her relationship. Now, her time belonged solely to her own future. Every hour of effort would feed into projects that strengthened her, with no dependence on the approval or recognition of anyone else. As the weeks passed, Amy began to rebuild her routine with a new sense of purpose. On Saturday mornings, she started volunteering at a nearby community library. There, she organized reading activities for children and teenagers, creating spaces where stories could spark curiosity and connection. The gentle chaos of small voices reading aloud and the quiet gratitude of parents gave her a kind of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. It was a place free from the sidelong glances or hushed comments she sometimes encountered from acquaintances who had heard whispers of the scandal. In the library, she wasn't the woman left at the altar. She was simply Amy, the enthusiastic teacher helping others fall in love with books. She also began to reconnect with friendships she had put on hold for the sake of her relationship. Coffee dates with former college classmates became a regular joy, as did leisurely Sunday walks through the park. Bit by bit, her laughter returned, no longer forced or masked by politeness. Amy discovered that she didn't need to fill every moment with company to feel whole. Solitude, once something she feared, became a space for reflection, a chance to hear her own thoughts without the interference of someone else's agenda. This new way of living gave her clarity. The pain of betrayal would not define her. Every small, deliberate choice she made was laying the foundation for a stronger, more self-assured version of herself. A year later, with her life steady and her heart no longer tender to the touch, Amy received a call she never expected. The name Penelope lit up her phone screen, and for a few seconds, Amy simply stared at it, as if deciding whether to open a door she had already locked. When she finally answered, the voice on the other end was quieter, stripped of its former brightness as though time and guilt had worn it down. Penelope began with an apology that felt rehearsed, her words tumbling into an explanation about how Maverick had been uncertain about marrying, and in that haze of doubt, the two had crossed a line they should never have even approached. Amy listened without interrupting, not because she needed justification, but because she wanted to gauge her own reaction. To her surprise, there was no surge of rage, no hollow ache, just a calm, steady detachment. When Penelope finished, Amy's voice was soft but decisive. She thanked her for calling, yet made it clear there was no place in her life for any renewed connection, not even the shadow of one. She explained she held no grudge, but the page had been turned, and her life existed now in a chapter where that old story had no relevance. When the call ended, Amy didn't cry or dwell on what was said. She simply set the phone down, feeling the quiet, liberating certainty that the door had closed for good. Months after that call, Amy found herself becoming a regular at a small coffee shop she passed on her way to school. It was a cozy place, the kind that smelled of freshly ground beans and warm pastries, with sunlight spilling across mismatched wooden tables. Behind the counter worked David, a barista with a calm, unhurried smile, who always greeted her with a lighthearted comment about the weather or the coffee of the day. At first, their exchanges were brief and casual, nothing more than a pleasant start to her mornings. But over time, the conversations began to stretch, weaving in small personal stories, shared interests, and even companionable silences that felt unexpectedly comfortable. There were no grand gestures, no sparks flying in cinematic bursts, just a quiet, steady warmth that began to feel like something worth keeping. With David, Amy realized she didn't have to trim away pieces of herself to fit into the shape of a relationship. She could keep her routines, nurture her work, and guard her personal space without it turning into a source of conflict. They took walks together, sometimes along tree-lined streets, sometimes without any destination at all. Occasionally, they cooked simple dinners in her apartment, laughing when recipes went sideways, and always talking openly about what they wanted, feared, or hoped for. There were no mind games, no half-truths, none of the subtle manipulations that had once hollowed her out. The connection was rooted in mutual respect, and it felt entirely new, like discovering that love could exist without erasing who you were. As her relationship with David quietly deepened, Amy's professional life was also finding new momentum. The school where she had taught for years offered her a long-awaited promotion, one that not only provided greater financial stability, but also the freedom to design and lead educational projects she had always dreamed of implementing. She launched a series of reading and creative writing workshops for students who struggled academically, programs that were soon celebrated by parents and staff alike. In collaboration with the community library where she volunteered, she created a small mentorship initiative, pairing older students with younger ones to foster both literacy and confidence. Every milestone was a reminder that her worth had never depended on the recognition or support of a partner. It had always been built on her own dedication, skill, and resilience. On a personal level, Amy felt as though she had finally found her balance. She cherished her time with David, yet she also protected moments of solitude. Afternoons spent reading on her balcony, quiet. Mornings walking through the park, evenings dedicated to painting or journaling. Her circle of friends was strong again, enriched by people who valued her boundaries and celebrated her growth. Gone were the days when she clung to relationships out of fear of being alone, or tolerated the presence of anyone who didn't match her level of commitment. The woman she had become would never again accept the silence of neglect or the erosion of self-worth she had once endured without protest. In her conversations with David, Amy occasionally shared fragments of her past, not as wounds to reopen, but as stories that belonged to another life. She spoke without dramatics, letting the facts stand on their own, and David listened without judgment or interruption. His quiet attentiveness gave her the rare freedom to speak without the fear of being reduced to her scars. Some evenings, they would sit on her balcony with mugs of tea, the city's soft hum in the background, and Amy would find herself smiling at the thought that every difficult step she had taken had somehow led her exactly here. It wasn't a naive kind of peace, the sort that comes from pretending everything is fine. It was a grounded calm, the assurance that she now had the tools and the self-respect to face whatever might come next. Over time, Amy began to notice that the people around her were seeing the changes too. Friends described her as more confident, more certain in her decisions, and her family, who had witnessed both her lowest point and her climb back up, looked at her with quiet pride. Even Great Aunt Rose, rarely one to indulge in overt praise, told her one afternoon, "You're made of a wood that doesn't splinter." Amy understood that this recognition wasn't born from a single dramatic moment, but from the accumulation of steady, intentional choices she had made since the day her life fell apart. That day had been a fracture, yes, but it had also been the first step in shaping a stronger, truer version of herself. One quiet Sunday morning, Amy and David wandered through a bustling local market, weaving between stalls of fresh produce, handmade crafts, and the warm scent of bread still cooling on racks. They stopped at a small jewelry stand where delicate pieces caught the sunlight in tiny flashes. Among them was a simple silver ring set with a turquoise stone, its color shifting with every angle as if it held a fragment of the sky. David picked it up, turned it gently in his fingers, and looked at her with a smile that was both tender and certain. Without kneeling or turning the moment into a spectacle, he asked if she'd like to wear it, not as a formal engagement, but as a symbol of the new chapter they were building together. Amy said yes, not because she needed a binding promise, but because she understood what the gesture meant. This wasn't about ownership or obligation. It was about recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of what they had built. Trust without fear, love without control. The ring didn't come with a ceremony or a price tag meant to impress, yet to her it carried far more weight than the diamond she had once thrown into a lake. Slipping it onto her finger, she felt no shadow from the past, only the light of everything she had gained, her independence, her dignity, and the freedom to walk beside someone who celebrated her autonomy instead of fearing it. In every sense, it was less a piece of jewelry and more a declaration of personal victory. In the years that followed, Amy kept her ties to the community alive and thriving. She expanded her volunteer work beyond the library, helping organize cultural events and small book fairs that drew entire families together. At school, her students didn't just see her as a teacher. They saw her as a mentor who understood that life rarely followed a straight, predictable line. She became the kind of adult who could sit with a struggling teenager, listen without rushing to fix everything, and remind them, through her own example, that it was possible to start over stronger than before. That connection with others grounded her, a constant reminder that her worth and her purpose extended far beyond any romantic relationship. One day, she was invited to speak at a regional educational conference on the topic of resilience. Standing at the podium, looking out at rows of faces, she began to share her story. She didn't dress it up with flowery language or strip it down to avoid discomfort. She told it as, it had happened, with all the fractures and turning points intact. As she spoke, she noticed people nodding, some with glassy eyes, as if they recognized pieces of their own journeys in her words. Amy hadn't come to inspire, but she realized she was doing exactly that. She explained how, despite the pain, she had refused to remain a silent victim, and how each choice afterward had been a deliberate step toward a life that felt authentically hers. By the time she stepped away from the microphone, she understood something deeply. Her story no longer weighed her down. It had become a bridge for others to cross into their own strength. As the years continued to roll forward, even the sharpest memories of that day began to dull. Amy could think of Maverick and Penelope without feeling the old, instinctive sting in her chest. They had become, in her mind, figures from another life, people who no longer had the power to touch the present she had built. She didn't crave more apologies, nor did she seek any final explanation. She had come to understand that the truest form of justice was not in watching someone else regret their actions, but in quietly, steadfastly living well. The echo of their betrayal had faded into silence, replaced by the steady hum of a life she had shaped entirely on her own terms. Today, when Amy looks back, she doesn't see that day as the worst of her life. She sees it as the moment that cracked open the door to everything that followed. She won't pretend the blow wasn't devastating. There had been nights so long they felt endless, mornings where her chest felt carved hollow. But she also knows that without that break, she might never have learned to choose herself first. Her story is no longer about betrayal. It's about the strength with which she stood back up, the choices she made in the aftermath, and the peace she feels each morning waking in a home that is wholly hers. To anyone who hears it, her message is unmistakable. Sometimes the ending you thought was tragic is, in truth, the beginning of the life you always deserved.